Hello. So last night, so week 5 in Fundamentals of Contract Law, we worked through the problem that you can see in front of you. Um, so I've made this recording for those of you who were unable to come to class and for the online students, really just because the messy nature of the activity itself meant that the recording, I think, will be quite frustrating. So I'm just going to do a high-level overview for you. Can I suggest that you print out a copy of this problem that you can see and have it next to you as you work through the problem and what we do next? So the first thing that I ask the students to do, and I ask you to pause and do this once you've heard the instructions, is to map out the facts and the relevant legal incidents that impact on this particular problem. So before we even go into the elements of the problem, so there are essentially two commercial relationships here. The one that we're most interested in is most likely the relationship between Timbertop Nurseries, Timbertop Nurseries and Ace Cubbies. I'm going to put Ace Cubbies down here. So at some point in time, the two of those have entered into a contract. Now we're going to assume, and it's perfectly relevant to assume here based on the words in the problem, that Timbertop Nurseries have contracted with Ace Cubbies, that this is a valid contract. In other words, it has all of the elements that we need for a contract. So that is agreement. Yes, you've heard it before. That's offer and acceptance, or if we can't identify those things, a meeting of the mind, consensus ad idem, that we have consideration, that we have an intention to enter into a legal relationship, and that we have certainty. So that we have all of those elements for this contract here. And the terms of that contract based on the information that we have, is that Ace Cubbies will deliver 20 cubby houses in exchange for the payment of $20,000, and that the delivery will take place by the 1st of October. So now we don't know when the contract was entered into, but we can work on the basis that it was entered into prior to the, entered into prior to the delivery date, because past consideration is not good consideration. So if we think about a timeline going forward, there is a due date here. Okay, the other relationship that might be relevant to this contract is, or to this problem I should say, is some kind of contract between a developer, let's call them just D, and Timbertop Nurseries. Presumably, we don't know, but at some time prior to the contract that we've just been talking about, these two parties, the developer and Timbertop Nurseries, entered into a contract that included, amongst other things, that 9 cubby houses, so, sorry, 9, can't write today, by cubby houses, let's call it that, be delivered by the 15th of October. So 15th of the 10th. So we can see already that there is some kind of buffer, let's call it that, between the time that Timbertop is expecting to get a group of cubby houses and the time that it needs to deliver it to one of its customers. Another relevant fact here too is that this $20,000 was paid by Timbertop to Ace Cubbies at the time the contract was signed. And so essentially, just talking about that first contract, it's a bilateral contract, but at the point that it's signed, both parties have made a promise to the other. Timbertop has promised to pay $20,000. And Ace Cubbies has promised to deliver the 20,000 cubby houses. Beautiful. The $20,000 is paid almost straight away, like milliseconds after the contract is made. but the 20 cubby houses are to be delivered in the future. But I'm hoping that you're with me here, that there are two promises that are made. One of them is a long-term promise, one of them is a short-term promise. Okay, so we mapped out these things. Then as we work through the facts, we notice, oh, this software only gives me a couple of colours, so I'm just going to clean up the board for us a little bit, having made that discussion. Okay, so the other thing that's happened though is along the journey here, Ace Cubbies has realised that it's underquoted and that the $20,000 is not going to be enough. It's chewed up all of that money and it's only built some cubby houses. So Ace Cubbies has basically said to Timbertop, look, we've thought about it, we're unable to continue. And Timbertop's thought about it too and thought, well, what are my options here? And so we talked about it in class that there were basically three options. One, they can basically, and the term we use here is anticipatory breach, something that you will learn more about in advanced contract, but essentially take it as a given that they have the opportunity to terminate the contract and sue Ace Cubbies because they have an enforceable right under the contract that's formed at this point here to have 20 cubby houses delivered. And in fact, they have a right to have them delivered by the 1st of October, and that isn't happening. So that's number one. Number two, as contemplates in the problem, they can go and get someone else to do it. So they can go and get quotes from other people, work out what to do. They've now got a shorter time frame in which to get them delivered. They're anxious to get 11 of them to sell in the Christmas period, and they've got another 9 that they've already pre-sold, so they will be in breach of a contract that they have with a third party. I think this will do this. So they'll have a breach of the contract that they have with the developer if they don't actually deliver those 9 cubby houses, plus they'll miss out on the profits that they were going to make in the Christmas season. It's worth noting too that 1 and 2 are not mutually exclusive. They could in fact do both, get someone else and sue Ace Cubbies. The next option that they have, or the final option that they have, is essentially to do what it looks like they've agreed to do, which is to increase the amount of money that they're going to pay to Ace Cubbies and make sure that they can get it done by the date that they need to get it done by. Okay, so these are the issues that we're dealing with, and it will already have you thinking about the question of whether the promise to pay $10,000 is enforceable. And because you're contract lawyers and you're already thinking like contracts, you'll be thinking, what's the consideration for that promise? Is there consideration there? So let's move on, and what I'm going to do is walk you through some questions that I asked in class, show you how the students answered it, and we'll talk about the details. Okay, so the first question that we discussed in the class was this one: whether the contract between Timbertop Nurseries and Ace Cubbies was legally binding. And the options that I gave the class to deal with were the ones on the screen. So yes, both parties were happy with the agreement. No, Ace Cubbies couldn't finish the work. Yes, consideration was given in the form of the cubby houses in return for $20,000. And no, the price was underquoted, so the consideration was inadequate. And students discussed this. So take a second, pause the video if you have to, and write down what you think the correct answer is. The reason for this, and look, I won't go through this each time, is often when we're weighing up between two and then we go and see what the right answer is, we convince ourselves we would have got it right. The actual act of writing it down will give you some insight into really how well you've understood the concepts as we go forward. So basically, as you can see, this was a poll. It's live at the time that I'm recording it, but my guess is I'll work on it, but you won't be able to participate directly in the poll. So once the students had uploaded their responses, and as you can see, only 11 of them were brave enough to do so, we saw basically the responses here. So essentially what we were able to ascertain, I'm able to ascertain from that, is everybody was satisfied that there was a contract, that there's an initial contract between Timbertop Nurseries and Ace Cubbies. And we spoke about that early on when we were drawing the timeline. We made the assumption based on the way the question was phrased that a contract was there. So in order to have a contract, that means we need to have consideration. Now, 27% have essentially said, yeah, both parties were happy with the agreement. But if we're going to be technically legally accurate, then what we need to be able to do is point to the actual existence of a contract. So we're assuming this is the only question or only response that referred to any element at all. And it refers to consideration being given in the form of the cubby houses in return for $20,000. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? We often think of consideration as price. So we think $20,000 is the consideration for the delivery of the cubby houses. And that's actually also accurate. At the time the contract is made, there are two promises. There's a promise to deliver the cubby houses, and in exchange for that promise, the price of that promise is $20,000. There's also a promise, very quickly fulfilled, but there's also a promise to pay $20,000. And the price of the promise to pay $20,000 is a promise to deliver the cubby houses by a particular date. So moving on from there, the next question that I asked, and I haven't even hidden the responses here, is what is the agreed price of the promise between the parties? Immediately, most students, as you can see from the responses that came up here, went straight to the $20,000 being the price for the delivery of the cubby houses by a particular date. So more correct answers would refer to the complexity of the promise, that it's delivery of the cubby houses by a particular date. What I saw less of was that the price of the promise to pay $20,000 was the promise to deliver 20 cubby houses. Now, a couple of people, as you can see, have referred to the $30,000 amount. So they're also thinking about the additional 10 grand that was paid later. And that's something that we're going to have to explore. But for the starting point, the more correct answer, or the correct answer in relation to the initial contract, is the price of the promise to pay $20,000 was a promise to build and deliver 20 cubby houses by a particular date. And the price for the promise to deliver those cubby houses by a particular date was a promise to pay, or $20,000 itself. Please excuse my emails popping up there. That's very annoying. So the next question was, would it have made any difference to the enforceability of the contract if the parties agreed that Timbertop Nurseries would only pay $1 for the cubby houses? Now, this raised a lot of conversation in the classroom. We're already in the position where we can see that $20,000 was a serious underquoting, so surely $1 isn't enough. And it fascinated me actually when this came up. Ultimately, now they've all gone to 100%. But we did move around a little bit in this area. So, and basically the answer to this is correct, no. Consideration must be sufficient. This whole inquiry we're making here is whether there is legally sufficient consideration. But consideration doesn't need to be adequate. And this really tests us and makes us think about that original $20,000. Even if it's a serious underquoting, it's still sufficient consideration for the promise to deliver the 20 cubby houses by the relevant date. The next question was a true or false one. Consideration was provided by Ace Cubbies to Timbertop Nurseries for the payment of $30,000. Now, that raised a little bit of discussion as well. There does seem to be a promise to pay a total of $20,000, Was there consideration for that promise? Most of the class thought that there was, but the majority, but 40% saw that there wasn't, and that 40% are the ones who are right at this point. Consideration, well, actually, yeah, I'm going to stand back. The question doesn't ask whether it was legally sufficient consideration. There's certainly no one event where there is a promise to pay $30,000 in exchange for consideration. There are two promises to pay money, one promise and one actual payment of $20,000, another promise to pay 10 where 2,000 is paid, and there's a promise to pay $8,000 later. So there are definitely promises to pay that money. What is the price for those promises? Now, the first one, the $20,000, it's clear. We've been there before. That's the promise to deliver the 20 cubby houses by a particular date. The promise to pay the balance, yeah, well, I think there is consideration for it. The question we have is whether it's legally sufficient consideration. And for the reasons that I'll go on to explain, if you're not already with me, is that it is false to say that there is legally sufficient consideration in this case. The next question we explored is here. Which exception to the legal duty rule could the agreement between Timbertop Nurseries and Ace Cubbies for Timbertop to pay an extra $10,000 fall into? Now, this language is really important. Which exception to the legal duty rule? So, as I was saying before, I don't believe that there is legally sufficient consideration. And the reasons for this is that whilst we might find that there is consideration, if we go through that timeline that I had before, actually, why don't I bring that up? So here you should be seeing on the screen the consideration mind map that I've used, or flowchart that I've used in some of the other recordings. And this basically asks us to look at, sorry, let me just get a pen up so that we can make sure that we're talking about the same thing. Here we go, pick red. So we're asking this keynote question: is there legally sufficient consideration? And that sufficiency is a serious part of the problem. So just working through this in the timeline, first we can think, actually I've decided red is going to be a really annoying colour to use with the circumstances we've got. So firstly, let's just get rid of the deed at the very beginning. We've got nothing in the question that suggests that the agreement was documented as a deed. So we know that this question about consideration is important. So firstly, we ask ourselves, benefit detriment. Do we have a benefit or a detriment in relation to the promise to pay the additional $10,000? Absolutely we do. Firstly, detriment on Timbertop's part is that they have promised to pay an extra amount of money. The benefit for them is they're going to get these cubby houses built on time. Secondly, do they have is there a benefit detriment for Ace Cubbies? Yes, there is. The benefit for them is they get an extra 10 grand. The detriment is they essentially are giving up the right that they have to terminate the contract. Even though it's a private law, it's not illegal. You have the right to terminate a contract. You need to wear the consequences, which might require paying damages. It might, a whole lot of different things. But at the end of the day, you still have that right. So yes, we do have the benefit detriment. We can find it. Is there the bargain requirement though? This, I think, is a little bit more problematic for the promise to pay the $10,000. The promise to pay the $10,000 is in exchange for a promise to deliver what is essentially an existing legal duty. So where have I got an existing legal duty? Here on the slide. So for consideration to be legally sufficient, it can't be the performance of an existing legal duty. And I think too that even if you can find that the bargain is there, that the promise to pay was in exchange for that detriment, the giving up of the right to terminate, the fact that it's a pre-existing legal duty is what impacts the question of whether or not it is sufficient consideration. So I think we're finding that for the $10,000 payment, we don't have legally sufficient consideration. But what we do have is an exception that is likely to fall within the realm. And in this case, I think that the exception we agree would be the practical benefit because we're looking at facts that are substantially similar to the facts in Williams and Roffey. Williams and Roffey is an English case which deals with exactly the same principles that came out of the Australian case, Musumeci and Winnerdell. So that was the case you'll remember about the premises, the grocery premises in a shopping centre, and the owners of the shopping centre who agreed to reduce the rent when a competitor came into the shopping centre received a practical benefit. Well, the court found that they received a practical benefit because they had there was a benefit for them in the supermarket or the shopping centre not being untenanted or having a full tenancy. So returning now to the question, let's see what the students had to say. So 82% overwhelmingly found that there was a practical benefit. My guess is you did too because of the way that you and I approached it. A couple of students saw there might be an issue here with a promise to benefit a third party. They were thinking about the developer in this context. But we don't in the facts see any link. So it might be that if the developer had paid the additional money, that a case like Himachan, Parmachan and Temple might have assisted. It might in fact be more likely actually fresh consideration. And then some students thought, well, maybe the original contract had been terminated and replaced. Again, we would need more evidence than that. You wouldn't need very much consideration, but it might be if the parties actually entered into an agreement to terminate the existing contract, and they were very formal about that. And very explicit, and set up a new contract where both of them waived their rights under the old one. That could have in fact been an outcome, but given the information we had, I don't think the facts actually supported that. And in an exam, you would really need to be quite explicit about the assumptions you were making in that regard. So, having established that there was a practical benefit, the question became, what was that benefit? And each of the options that I provided to the students was on the is on the slide here. So have a think about that and think about what the benefit could be. It was interesting. Everybody saw that the cubbies being well made, in fact, there's nothing in the facts to support that anyway, wasn't relevant. I think the correct answer interpretation based on the facts that we have is here with both A and C. So the practical benefit to Timbertop was it didn't have to go through the time and expense of solving its problem by getting somebody else to build these. It also specifically didn't want to lose the business or breach the contract that it had with the developers. At the end of the day, the fact that the cubby houses were delivered on time is the fact that provides these two benefits. And again, so I'm being quite explicit about the language here. So whilst that is what happened, the benefit is that they didn't have to get somebody else to do it and that they would be able to maintain their relationship under the other contract. So then the question became whether Ace Cubbies provided consideration to the nurseries for the additional payment. Three options here, so it's slightly difficult to read, it's a little scrunched up on the screen. But the options were that the cubbies were delivered on time. No, there's a promise to perform an existing legal duty. Yes, Timbertop promised to pay Ace Cubbies, so it was bound by the promise it made. Or lastly, the original contract price couldn't be altered. So what did student think? The majority fell into the correct interpretation. No, there was no consideration for the reasons when I went through the flowchart earlier, that the actual promise was for in exchange for the promise to pay the extra $10,000 was only a promise to perform an existing legal duty. And the rules show us that consideration, which is made up of an existing legal duty, is not legally sufficient consideration. So explore the other two options, and in particular, where 22% of students thought that completing the cubbies on time, that really came out of a misunderstanding of what the practical benefit exemption is. It is not that we find consideration when there is a practical benefit. It is because there is a practical benefit that there is an exception for the requirement to have legally sufficient consideration at all. So the last question that we asked was, does Ace Cubby have a claim against Timbertop Nurseries for the outstanding amount? And at the end of the day, we got to this result. Again, the majority of students, I think, are correct here. Consideration was given in the form of cubby houses in return for the $20,000. Oh, sorry, I've moved on to the next slide by accident. Sorry. Silly me. And yes, all of the students, I was thinking, what was going on there? All of the students saw that, yes, they would have a claim under the practical benefit exemption to the existing legal duty rule. The fact that there was no consideration for that promise to pay that $10,000, of which $8,000 hasn't been paid yet, didn't matter. Because you would be able to find the practical exemption applied. Now, on the balance of probabilities, if you sued for it. So I hope you found that a fun exercise. I hope you did actually stop along the way and have a go at answering the questions. Much quicker to go through it this way. For those of you who are able to come to class, there really is a lot of benefit in going through these exercises. And so, I love to see you there, including those of you who, UA and work and live in Melbourne. You are always welcome. But for those of you who aren't there, let's think about how we can do some of these quiz type questions in a drop-in tutorial sometime. In the meantime, have a good week and we'll talk soon. Cheers.